Hey guys, we're here today in Dragon's Dogma 2, going over 5 tips for playing the Trickster. The Trickster is an incredibly unique vocation that turned out to be quite a bit of fun, even though I wasn't really interested in picking it up at all. And whether you're here because you're interested in trying it out yourself, it's one of your favorite vocations, or you're reluctantly playing it simply to max out all the vocations in the game, you've probably noticed by this point that it is definitely weaker than the other vocations since you can't put out any damage yourself. This can be a downside that's incredibly difficult to work around, but ideally some of these tips can help you play the vocation to the best of your ability and make it as strong as possible. Tip number 1 is to have the right pawn skills in your group. Overall, the Trickster does pretty good in fights against small enemies that are in large groups, since they can draw the attention of the monsters towards one of their own and whittle down the enemies. But where the Trickster really lacks is against large creatures, so it's important that you put a focus on your pawn skills and select skills specifically for taking down big enemies. Most notably, the stabs from the fighter or the warrior, or the gut and run or skull splitter abilities from the thief are incredibly good at taking down big enemies and hitting those weak spots. A couple abilities that I really liked while playing the Trickster that aren't specifically good at hitting weak spots is Ice Affinity from the mage. By freezing the big enemies, you can give yourself time as the Trickster to set up a new Simulacrum and build threat with the monster to pull it away from the pawns. I also like using Celerity, so you can run away from danger better, weave in and out of enemies, and Celerity can make summoning a new Simulacrum go much nicer. But my favorite ability to have in the group was Explosive Arrow from the Archer. Not only is it pretty solid at taking down weak spots, but a lot of times your pawn will throw out explosive arrows and not detonate them themselves, which actually gives you a way to swing at enemies and create explosions while your pawn is dealing with other things. You might come across different skills that you enjoy using with your Trickster, so try and look out adding any of the high single target abilities, or things like Explosive Arrow or Prescient Flare, to give you something to also hit as the Trickster and still contribute to the damage. Tip number 2 works right along with treating your Trickster like a tank, and that is to stack knockdown resistance on your rings, your augments, and your gear enhancements. You don't actually take a very good hit as Trickster, but you're drawing aggro to yourself and your Simulacrum constantly. When that Simulacrum is killed or dissipates, all that attention goes to you, and you can quickly absorb too much damage, especially if you get knocked down to the ground. The key with the Trickster is to avoid being knocked down to the ground or staggered, so you can move out of situations and areas that could be potentially fatal. If you have a Simulacrum go down mid-combat after you've generated a lot of aggro on everything surrounding you, it can be incredibly difficult to get a new one up, so as much stagger and knockdown resistance as you can manage will allow you to stand there for a little bit longer while you're trying to get that Simulacrum skill to finish, and get back to diverting the enemy's attention off of you. On top of that, almost all the Trickster's skills are in point blank range, so even when you have all the attention on your Simulacrum, you have to get really up in the fray, especially against big enemies, in order to have any effect on the fight at all. This means that any area effect or slams on the ground can potentially knock you down or stagger you, and become quickly fatal depending on how much hit points you have. Tip number 3 is to utilize all the objects around you and utilize your ability to throw things in order to get damage into the fight. Throwing crates, jars, or picking up dead corpses of enemies and throwing them at other ones can be a massive way to help your pawns in the fight and deals a lot more damage than it seems like it should. You stack this with a couple of the vocation's augments to carry things longer or to run faster while carrying things, and it'll seem like a real skill for your character and something you should have been doing all along. As soon as you get one enemy killed in the fight, picking up its corpse and throwing it into others can knock them off cliffs, deal heavy damage, or stun them at the perfect time. And although you have no elemental magic of your own, using fire jars or water jars can be a great aid in taking down the slimes in the game, or marking enemies to be lit on fire or frozen by your pawns. So instead of breaking every crate or jar you come across in order to see if there's loot inside, try and keep them around once you get into fights. That way you can use them at strategic times, put a little bit of damage in the battle, along with diverting the attention of things where they need to be. Tip number 4 is to carry tomes in your inventory and utilize them for the big fights. I wouldn't necessarily burn up tomes in every fight you're in, since the Trickster does handle small enemies fairly well, but on the big enemies, they can be a great help to hit their weak spot with something like High Levin whenever they get knocked down to the ground, or to exploit the enemy's elemental weakness in the right moment. The good thing with the Trickster is because they can divert attention to their Simulacrum, they don't have a lot of problems with the cast time on the tomes, like a lot of the other vocations. Although the Trickster does have a decent time dealing with the small enemies, there are situations where you can get an entire group of enemies killed down to one, and then have trouble getting rid of that last enemy if you have too many pawns down, or you're in situations where your pawns are currently incapacitated, or maybe put to sleep. And this is another area where the tomes can come in, just to clean up the end of a fight and handle one enemy that's left. And tip number 5 is to try and keep a Simulacrum up as often as you can. Now obviously you'd be doing this during fights, but the important part is to do it in between fights. Using Invoking Essence while you're running around the map doesn't cost you any stamina and can drag the Simulacrum right along your back with you. If you don't like having the Simulacrum directly on your back while you're running around, the distance you can draw it before it dissipates is actually fairly decent. So every so often while you're running, you can just click Invoking Essence and yank it to that spot over and over as you travel around. The Simulacrum obviously isn't generating any threat when you enter into combat, but in my experience, summoning a new Simulacrum has the longest animation of any of the Trickster abilities, so if you already have a Simulacrum up when you get ambushed, you can go immediately into generating threat onto that Simulacrum in a large area, instead of having to worry about enemies hitting you while you're trying to get one newly summoned. And as you get your Trickster high enough, Invoking Essence will actually heal and mint your Simulacrum, making it very easy to keep this thing up between fights if you manage things correctly. Hopefully this video helped you out, and at least one of these tips can help you maximize the potential of the Trickster and make it as strong as possible. If you've got any tips with the Trickster that you've learned while playing it, please post them down in the comments so you can help your fellow Arisen, regardless if Trickster is their favorite and they just want to improve at it, or if they're just reluctantly suffering through it and hoping to make it as pain-free as possible. Or perhaps there's more out there like me who were dreading playing the Trickster, but started to actually enjoy it and appreciate the uniqueness of this vocation. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time.